What's up animators, Sharp here and welcome back to part 6 of the Abandoned House Beginner Blender course. Where in the last part we took care of all the foliage, out of the trees, the grass, the bushes and stuff, making use of online assets to save some time. Where in this part we're tackling the elephant in the room and finally making the textures for the house and of course the ground. We've got a lot to learn and some very interesting tools to use. So buckle up and let's begin. But first, if you like this course, drop a like, hit the bell, you know the drill. Let's go. First up, we're collecting some textures online because making them from scratch is way too complicated for a general course like this. Plus, we're not allowed to use Substance Painter, so the plan is simple. We'll get a bunch of textures online. Then, we'll unwrap the model, paint the masks, making use of the different color channels to blend the different materials together, and tweak it off with some procedural nodes that automatically adjust to the geometry. So I'm getting some different floor texture variants. Then I'll get 4 variants of plaster so we can give more personality to the walls, where each variant is more damaged and moldy, like 4 stages of wear and tear. Then I'll get a wood material for the beams, some brick tiles for the chimney, and some non-tiled cement for the roof tiles. Now, if you want to UV unwrap the model, we first need to apply all the modifiers, because the geometry we have so far is completely fake. So I'll save this project as a different name so we keep a copy of this, and I'll save it as house_3 or something, so we can come back to this anytime if we happen to need it. Let's start UV unwrapping the floor. I'll make everything invisible and turn off all the particle systems. Now, coming back to part 3, where we had the UV crash course, where do we need to make cuts on this model so we can unfold it onto a flat surface? I mean, apart from a few little bumps, I guess we could just press it down and it'd be flat, so I'd say nowhere. Let's just hop into edit mode, select everything, and unwrap it as it is. The UVs are a little bit squiggly, but that's minimal deformation, plus the texture is organic, so that's perfectly fine. Let's move on to the house. Hide the floor. Now the house is made of a lot of tiny objects, so I say we go through them one by one and just unwrap them as we go. Starting off with the base, I'll press the / key to isolate everything. I also like to do my UV unwrapping in solid mode, because it's easier to see the shape this way. I'll open my trusty UV editor and get to work. If we simply unwrap this without any cutting or preparation, we'll get funky results. And although it might look okay in the UV editor, remember there's 2 sides on this shape, so this is totally whack. And to prove that, I'll give it a new material, call it test material. Hopping in the shader editor real quick, I'll add a checker texture and press Ctrl-T to get the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. I'll use UV as my mapping and plug this into my base color. If I hop into material mode, you can see that my texture is now stretching. This is supposed to be perfectly square grids. It becomes even worse when you scale it up so you can actually see what's going on. The UVs on this object are squished, so any texture that gets placed here will be deformed by the UV, so we need to properly UV unwrap this. A little insert, before you unwrap anything, make sure you always apply the scale, or the texture will be deformed regardless of what you do. Now I'll unwrap it again just to prove that that wasn't the issue and we still have to properly unwrap it, but now you know the drill. So where should we place cuts on a shape like this to unwrap it onto a flat surface? Well, if I wanted to get fancy and unfold this whole thing in one big shape, there's a lot of little corners and edges, which would be a pain in the bum to unwrap. So I just say we chop this whole thing in 3 big parts. I'm just gonna go around and select the entire top edge, and when I come full circle, press U and select Mark Seam. You can also right-click that option and save it to your quick favorites, so whenever you press Q, you get a little menu with all your favorite settings. That's what I did, so it's way faster. Now, if we imagine that this red line is an actual cut in the shape, this top part should just come off and it's already flat. It shouldn't actually come off, I just did that as a demonstration. So the top is done, we should only focus on the bottom now. When I select the top part, it's technically a UV island, it's independent from the rest. And for the bottom, I reckon the most simple thing is just to repeat the process. Let's just cut out the bottom as well. So we have the top and the bottom separate, already flat, and the only thing we have to worry about is this ring in the middle. If I try to unwrap that, it's gonna get completely broken because it's a circle, it's connected to itself. You can't unfold that, it's a circle. What we have to do is cut that circle so it turns into a long strip, then we can unfold it. But wherever you place a cut, they'll make a seam in the texture because those 2 parts are using 2 completely different areas of the UV map. That's why it's called Mark Seam. So it's very important to place these cuts where they won't be seen from the POV of the camera. So we'll place our first one back here, because nobody can see that. If we unwrap it now, it's easy to unwrap, but it's taking up the entire height of the UV square, which is called a udem, by the way. If we want the textures to be equally dense, all those UV islands have to be proportional to each other, otherwise some will look very high quality and others will look like they come out of a toaster. If I'm using a 2K texture, this elongated thing will only take up about 20 pixels, so that's 20 pixels for this entire edge here. That sounds like toaster textures to me. But if we chop this thing even more, we turn one long UV strip into several short ones, and the UVs can look more like this. Sorry for my bad drawing skills. Anyway, now we understand the concept, so now let's actually focus on the UVs. So I'll add more cuts to the strip on the edges hidden by the camera, and unwrapping this gives us a much better result. Now to keep the scale of all these parts consistent, I'll just unwrap them all at once. That's how Blender keeps the scale relative. This is what our UV map looks like, and the squares are now completely square, no tilting or stretching happening. That's what you actually want. The coverage could be better because all these empty areas are just texture resolution that nobody is using, so we're throwing all of that away. But this isn't a custom texture, this is a tileable texture. Just like with the trees in part 4, a tileable texture can be tiled next to each other without any seams. So I can just scale up my UV map as much as I want, the textures can repeat, and I'll get endless resolution. And this is the process. Moving on to the next item, the chimney. We'll probably be able to flatten this if we just cut along one of the corners, the ones facing away from the camera, and cut off the top. After unwrapping, the UV outline looks very funky, like it's pinching. And that's because I forgot to cut off the bottom. You can't unfold this shape. These edges are these edges. So I'll cut 3 of them and leave one of them to function like a flap. When I unwrap this again, the issue is fixed, and you can also see this little flap that we made. The top is still wonky, and we can always check that by unfolding again. Yup, that's still very wonky. I'll just make a flap cut for the bottom face and leave these faces alone so they can unfold. But there's still an issue after unfolding because the top ring is still connected. It's holding the inner edges and it's holding itself by the hands. If this is confusing to you, imagine having this shape out of paper and you have to flatten it onto the floor without ripping or folding it. Now you could make 3 cuts around the top and you would get 4 shapes like this, which would still intersect on the top because they're connected on the bottom. We could chop up the bottom as well, but then the model would be full of texture seams and it wouldn't look too realistic. So instead, let's select these edges and clear all the seams. This could also be found in the U dropdown. I just put it in my quick favorites because it's faster. And instead, cut away this ring so the bottom section can still unwrap normally, and the ring on top is already flat, so that's it. Now we have differently scaled UV islands, so let me just select the whole thing and unwrap it again. So it's proportional. Now we have the second chimney, which is still the result of the array modifier we made. So it has the same geometry, same UVs, same texture, but it's not real, so we can't change any of that. So we'll make it real by hopping into the modifier tab and applying the array modifier with this icon here. Now both of these are individual chimneys, they're 2 different meshes inside one object. The geometry is now real, they don't affect each other anymore. Now I'm gonna select this whole chimney by pressing Shift and Z to enter wireframe X-ray mode. This lets you select through everything, useful shortcut. And I'm just gonna move its UVs away so they're using different parts of the texture. If they use the same part of the texture, that would look weird. Or you can just unwrap both of them at once, that also works. Now we're done with the chimneys. I'll just give them the test material just to double check that everything is okay. And it is. Now I'll hold your hand through one more model, which are these crisscrosses on the wall, because this video is already pretty long and the process is repeating itself and there's nothing new that I can teach you about UV unwrapping. So let's go. These crosses are wooden decoration on the walls. But if we take a closer look, notice how all the back sides are just pressed up against the wall and nobody can see them. Why not simply delete them? It will simplify the UV unwrapping process by a lot, so let's do that. Select the back faces and simply delete them. And obviously do that for all the crosses around the house. The back faces being the faces that are resting on the walls, that are invisible to anybody. Now that we've done this, the UV process should be very, very simple. We have these rectangles without the back face. If you want to unwrap them, all you have to do is just cut all 4 of the corners. And you can just unfold all the flaps and that's it. You can also see that when I give it the test material. It works. If you remember from part 1, the way you select parallel edges is by holding Ctrl, Alt, and clicking. Select these corners, mark them as seams, and unwrap them to see for yourself. To select multiple loops, you just add Shift to the mix. So Ctrl, Alt, Shift, click, all the edges. I'm not making this up. Blender is known for its long shortcuts, but the logic behind them is very logical, so you get used to it very quickly. So just select all the edges, mark a seam, select everything and unwrap, and boom, you have all the crisscrosses done. Now let's speed this up a bit. Next up is the door. It's flat, but it's got intrusions, so unwrapping it as it is will deform it a bit. Add cuts around the intrusions and in the corners of those intrusions. The more you do this, the easier it becomes, trust me. Unwrap, test material, move on. If you're wondering why some of the squares are bigger than the others, that's because the objects are different size, but they take up the same amount of space in the UV square. That's why we unwrap everything at once, so they're proportionally sized to each other. We'll do this in the end, we're just unwrapping everything now. Next up is a door frame. It's just rectangles. Delete the back faces and cut the corners, that's all you have to do. Now, the horizontal divider is a bit tricky, so I'll help you out here. First, we have to apply the solidify modifier to turn this thickness into actual geometry. Now, normally you would cut out every cube and cut its corners and treat the top part as an individual plank and cut it up that way, but that would take ages, so I have a shortcut for you. Hop into wireframe X-ray mode, which is Shift-Z like we said before, and of course edit mode, edge select mode, and now drag select everything on this altitude. This will select all the vertical edges of the cubes, making the whole process easier. Mark those as seams. Now hop into vertex select mode and select this row of vertices, then hop into edge mode. We'll now deselect the bottom edges which are out here in the open, like this. By doing that, we've effectively selected all the edges required as I've explained before. Leave the corner ones, they'll help you unwrap the main plank above, but all the cubes have been cut out and had their corners cut apart, so you can just unwrap those normally now. Mark them as seams, select full edge loops of the corners, mark those as seams, now select everything and unfold. Now look at these nice UVs, and we did it super fast with our big, massive, wrinkly, smart brain. This is what it's all about. Always remember to apply the scale, because if you unwrap two objects, one of them has applied scale, one doesn't, the density of the UV will be different, because Blender thinks that this is still a huge object that was just scaled down, so it will give it more UV space. This is called texel density. Just apply the scale. House base. We already made a roof, so get rid of this. I'll cut this corner because this whole thing can be flat, and I'll cut here as well because there's a pillar hiding this edge. I'll delete the floor because it's not visible, and I'll cut this edge as well so it's disconnected. This is unwrapped nicely, cut here, this unwraps nicely, unwrap. You know the gist of all this, just remember to apply the modifiers first. You should be able to unwrap these by yourself. If you've got a mirror or array modifier there, apply it after you've done the UVs, because the duplicated model will already have the UVs done, so you save yourself some work. After it's applied, move the other UVs so they don't use the same parts of the texture. I'm now skipping all the UV mapping you're already capable of doing, so let's talk about the windows. We instance those instead of duplicating, so after you make one, they should all be done. Except the ones in the back, we made those special. I'll place all the same windows in a new collection and put that collection inside the house collection, so it's more organized. But now they're using the same parts of the UVs because they're instances. So in order to move those UVs apart, we have to convert them from instances into real objects. Select all of them, drop down objects and then relations, then select make single user and pick object and data. Now all these windows are actual objects with their own UVs, thoughts, and dreams, and they can be unwrapped independently. The back two windows are also instances, so repeat that process there as well. The next interesting bit happens when you unwrap these roof supports. You know those little rectangles that support the roof? Yeah, those. So after unwrapping them, then apply the array modifier to get your finished UVs copied on all of them. And instead of manually moving those UVs around or re-unwrapping everything, press F3 to search for UV transform random. Open the operation box down here and change the location X and Y both to at least 1 meter. This is the same distance when the UVs start repeating itself, so by typing 1 meter you get all the possible variations possible. But this only works for tileable textures. Again, we are repeating that texture infinitely. Next thing is the horizontal wood beams. I'll add an extra edge and cut in the middle so it can unfold better and not take up as much space. Now let's unwrap the roof. I left that for last because it's special. First, apply the solidify modifier, but keep all the rest. This entire roof is made from a single roof tile. We'll unwrap this as normally. I'll turn the modifiers off for edit mode using this button, then isolate selection and hop into edit mode. I'll cut a U shape on this side, cut this corner and cut a U shape on the other side. When unwrapping, this will give me a nice unfold out of a single piece. There's a little deformation, but it's really nothing noticeable. But to take care of it, you can select one of the straight faces, press L to select linked, press F3 to search, and look for follow active quads. Now use the length average operation. This will strengthen all your faces according to your selected one, so this whole thing is much more straight now. Now apply all the modifiers, turning all these tiles into real geometry, but I also want to throw these roof tiles around so they're more broken, random, and messy. I'll put them all in a new collection, which I'll put in the house collection. Then I'll hop into edit mode, select everything, and press P for the separate menu, and separate by loose parts. So any mesh that's not connected will become its own object, meaning all the roof tiles are now individual objects. Select them all, right-click and set their origin to geometry. This way they'll move and rotate from their centers. Now select everything and F3 search for Object Transform, Randomize, Transform. This will randomly throw them around. Give them a little bit of randomness on the XYZ axes for both position and rotation. Don't overreact. You can mess with the seed value to get different variations, and finally press Ctrl and J to merge them all back into a single object and rename it. They're still sharing the same parts of the UV texture though, so select everything in edit mode and F3 search for UV Transform Randomize. Randomize location X and Y to 1 to get all the possible variations. Now we need to repeat this process for all other roofs. Apply Solidify modifier, unwrap, apply all modifiers, separate by loose parts, center pivot points, randomize transform, merge, randomize UVs, and our house is now all unwrapped and ready for texturing. But before we do that, we'll also shatter the windows. I'll select all of them by right-clicking their collection and clicking Select Objects. You can do that, by the way. Isolate Selection. I want to give my windows thickness, and they'll need their own material anyway, so I want to separate them from the frames. Select all the window faces, but we have a lot of them, so here's a shortcut. You can select just one face. I've already selected multiple because I thought of this idea later. That doesn't matter. Your active selection is what matters. Drop down Select, open Select Similar, and choose Area. This will select all the faces on your mesh with a similar face area, which should be the majority of your windows. Manually select the rest, then press P to separate and separate by selection. Now I'm gonna merge all the windows together to avoid confusion and isolate them, so now I'm only looking at the glass bits. For the shattering part, I'm gonna separate the windows that I want to shatter into their own objects, because the shatter effect works on the whole object, and we need them separated for that. I reckon 3 windows should be enough. Isolate those now, because I really only want to focus on what I'm doing right now. Select one of the windows and equip the annotation tool. This is what I was using to write and draw on the screen before, but now it's going to be more useful. Up here, there's a placement drop-down, which lets me draw on the faces of my geometry. So whatever I draw will be directly on that face. I'll draw 2 little dots. Now we need to open Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and look for the Cell Fracture add-on, and activate it. Now press F3 and search for Cell Fracture. This brings up this scary looking menu here, where we'll select the annotation pencil for the point source. Increase the noise a bit or play with some of the settings if you want, and then click OK. Blender will now start shattering your window. I got this as a result, and there's a few big chunks here that were left from the shattering process. That sometimes happens, just delete them. You can erase the annotation quickly by holding D and erasing with right click. Now we're left with the original glass and a whole lot of random fragments. I'll merge all the fragments into a single object and make my original glass invisible. Then I'll hop into edit mode and delete all the faces that would be floating if this was a shattered glass. Actually, we can delete the original glass, we don't need it anymore. This is pretty much it. Now we just repeat this with 2 other windows. So draw the source of your cracks with the annotation tool with the surface option on, F3 search for cell fracture, choose annotation tool, play with settings if you want, press OK, get rid of the original glass and extra fracture bits left over, merge all the fracture glass into one object, then clean up the shattered glass. You can also press K to use the knife tool and draw your own shapes to make the glass more interesting, and it's simple as that. We have 3 shattered windows now. Now select all the glass panes without all the wooden frames, merge them together and give everything a solidify modifier, because real glass is not paper thin. Now the glass is sitting on a flat wall and glass is transparent, so we can see the wall behind it. We need to cut those holes. So select the house base and the windows, isolate selection and go to edit mode. We're gonna cut out the holes for every window. Now whatever I do to this mesh could ruin the UVs that I've made. So open the options dropdown and turn on live unwrap. This way the UV map will automatically adjust to the changes we make. And I'll keep it open on the side so I can constantly monitor if anything goes wrong. I'm gonna inset this face and it looks like it's not updating if I try scaling the faces. So I'll select this edge and double press G to edge slide. This way it works. Slide the other one in and then press K for my knife tool and just manually make 2 cuts here to isolate the windows. If you want to detach the cut, just right click. We've been over this in part 1. I know that we've technically created 2 angons here because these 2 faces are made up of 6 points, but we'll conveniently just ignore that because the entire front face of the house is completely planar, aka flat. We know that because it was made from a single polygon, and this way it's not gonna give us any shading issues. We're breaking the rules now. It is wrong and we should fix it, but in this example, it's fine. Delete these two faces and the windows are working. Now I'll cut out the rest of the windows, or at least the ones that are visible to the camera. Make sure the UVs are fine and only use the double G sliding method if you want to move things around, as that's the only way it seems to preserve the UVs. Anyway, here's a time lapse. This house now has holes behind the windows exposing the inside. Here you can import an image as a plane of a Baroque interior and put it on the inside to fake that there's something inside the house rather than modeling the entire interior now. But honestly, I completely forgot about anything on the inside of the house, but my windows were so reflective that nobody noticed. Whew. I mean, if it was noticeable, I would have seen it and did something about that, so that's fine. Now let's add some ivy to the house to make it seem like really old and abandoned. I promise we'll get to the textures. First, I'll open this side, which is down below in the description of the video, where you'll find this free ivy generator geometry node setup. Just type in a fair price, which could also be 0 if you want. Proceed here, type in your email address and click get. You'll be sent the file to your email, but I think you can also download it here. You'll get this blend file, which you should put in a specific folder where you keep all your Blender projects, and I'll explain why. Because we'll put this in our asset library. What is that? Well, it's a library of all the things you've ever created or downloaded, and you can very quickly access that through Blender, where you can basically just drag and drop anything into your project and it works really fast. So copy the file path to this project. Now inside Blender, we'll go to Edit, Preferences, and File Paths. Under Asset Libraries, you'll click this plus icon and add a new library and rename it however you wish. Then you'll paste the copied file path here using Ctrl and V. I've already done that for mine, and as you see, all the subfolders will also work with that as long as your project is somewhere in here. Now that our project file is being detected, we also have to prepare that in the original project. So open up your downloaded Ivy thing, and in here we got a mesh called Ivy Generator and a collection called Ivy Instance, both packed inside another collection called Ivy. This Ivy Generator mesh is the geometry node setup, and it's using the things inside Ivy Instance to generate that Ivy. All you have to do is right-click the Ivy Generator and click Mark as Asset. It will automatically link all the other collections, meshes, or materials it needs so it can function properly. It will detect all that, and then that's it. There's no and then. That's it. You've made your asset. Your Blender file is in a folder. That folder is in your asset library, and the thing you want from this file is marked as an asset. That's all you need. I'll now save my project under a new name again, so we have this copy in case we crash. Now I'll select the scene collection and change my timeline into the asset browser. Never mind all this, yours will be empty, this is all my stuff. Just change this all drop down to whatever you named your asset library to. Now it will only show your assets. I've added this Ivy generator a long time ago, and I've already organized it into subfolders, so I have to find it. Pretty sure it was in Objects and Nature. Yeah, here it is. Now just drag and drop it into your scene, and it's there. You can do that for any project. It's in there forever now. We see the two Ivy branches, which are the ones from the instance collection. We can just disable that. And the Ivy generator is a tiny dot way down here. It uses vertices to generate the Ivy. So I'll hop into edit mode, select everything, and delete all the vertices in case something was there, so now it's completely empty. Now in Asset Library, I'll add a plane, move it over, and then change my asset browser into Geometry Nodes Editor, so I can show you how it works. Geometry nodes are a procedural way of modeling and creating smart system using nodes, and it's way too complicated to explain in a general tutorial like this. But it takes your original geometry and performs several chained operations in it that cross-reference each other and give you amazing results in the end. This one is set up in a way so it gives you all the tweaking parameters you need on the right in the Modifier tab, so you can tweak it on the go. Let's change this back into a timeline now because we don't need this anymore. This Ivy generator needs a target collection to function. This is the geometry on which it will create the Ivy. In our case, that's the house collection. We can already see some Ivy being generated because we put that plane there. Back into edit mode, we can move these points around, extrude them and stuff, and each vertex will generate more Ivy onto the house. I'll press M to merge and merge all of them at center. I want to start at square one. Now move this vertex around and extrude more vertices to make a nice looking ivy plant. You can also tweak anything on the right, like the resolution, the amount of ivy, the loops, the randomness, the scale, and so on. Play around with it, it's supposed to be fun. You can also duplicate vertices and have them completely disconnected to the main branch, and make an entirely new patch of ivy on the other side, as long as it's all in the same object. And bam, I think this looks pretty nice. Don't overreact, make it seem believable, and of course, make it look good from the camera. And now, we'll start with the texturing. I'll save this project again under a new name so we have a backup, better safe than sorry. And now we'll start with the floor. Select the floor and give it a material. Let's turn off the particle systems for this and hop into the shader editor as well. We'll drag in all the textures for one of our materials: diffuse, ambient occlusion, normal, and roughness. Connect diffuse, put ambient occlusion to non-color and add a mix node set to color, diffuse in color A, ambient occlusion in color B, set it to multiply, plug it in, and then control the strength of the factor. Roughness to non-color, plug it in, normal to non-color, plug it through a normal map, and plug that in. So far it's all classic. Make sure to actually plug it into color rather than strength though. I'm still an idiot. Now select one of the textures and press Ctrl and T for the mapping nodes, and connect that to all of your textures. Then shift and right-click drag across all of these connections to wire them together, so it's more organized and easier to disconnect. Now if we mess with the mapping scale, we can control the size of the texture. Scale it up enough times so the rocks on the texture look normally sized compared to the house, so the texture is at a realistic scale. Now it looks good, but the texture tiles and it looks gross. That's also the reason why we merge and paint multiple textures together, so we can hide the tiling. And if you're wondering what this is, I tried to use the displacement texture, but it's not really worth it, so I just got rid of it. Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. It was worth a try. Now I'll select all this and press Ctrl J to put it in a frame. I'll select that frame and press F2 to rename it, just to stay organized. We need to set up all of our materials like this now, so I'll duplicate the principled BSDF and press Alt-P to unparent it from the frame. I'll drag in all the other textures from the second floor material and connect all of them up the same way. Add the mapping nodes and scale them till they look nice, put it in a frame, rename it. You can also select the frame and press N to open the sidebar. In the node tab, you can give it a custom color, so it's easier to stay organized again. Organization is very important. Now that we have two materials in here, I'm gonna press Shift A to add a new image texture. Click on New and set it to 2K resolution. Call it Floor Mask and click OK. Then add a mix shader node and connect both of those principled BSDFs into it. The factor will now blend between both of those principled BSDFs, but later we'll paint onto the image texture, which will act like a mask between those two. Currently, the image is still black, so we'll only reveal the top socket, so you can flip those inputs around if you want. But now make sure you have your image texture selected. You don't need to have it previewed like I do, just selected. Have your floor selected, and then press Ctrl and Tab to open up this pie menu, and this time we'll select Texture Paint mode. Press T for the toolbar and select the Draw tool. Now your brush will draw on the texture. If we preview the mix shader, you'll see that the white parts are now revealing the second texture. So you can paint between one texture and the other. Up here, so you can change the color of the brush, but you can also right-click to do the same thing. Okay, this is the concept. Now, let's take it a step further. Let's add a separate XYZ node and plug your image texture into it. If we paint a yellowish color here now, and preview the X, Y, and Z channels, X is red, Y is green, Z is blue, it goes in order for RGB, you'll see that the red and green channels will be bright, but the blue channel will be dimmer, because yellow is a mixture between red and green. So those two channels have a high value and blue doesn't have as high of a value. So we can use this image to paint 100% red, 100% green, and 100% blue, and we'll have three completely separate masks in a single image because we separated the RGB channels. We'll be using each channel as a new individual mask. So let's use the X, the red channel, for the first factor. Now when picking the color, go to RGB and only put the red value all the way up to 1. The rest are 0. This is now a 100% red color and it's only going to paint on the red channel. So let's paint a little walkway and break the texture apart a little bit. Time-lapse time! Now that I think it looks nice, I'll add another principled BSDF and connect all the textures from the next material onto it. Same process as before, plug everything in, except the difference with this material, we've also been given a mask texture, which is the mask for leaves specifically. So I'll add a hue saturation value node to the base color and use the mask texture as a factor input for it. So this node will only affect the leaves. I'll just add some color correction to it. Then add another mix shader node where I'll plug in the result from the previous mix shader in, and the new new material into the second socket. Then I'll plug Y, the green channel, into the factor. So now when I paint 100% green, I'll reveal the third material on top of everything else. Let's paint in some leaves, another time-lapse time. Now, I'm no Picasso, this isn't a masterpiece, and you can get custom and more interesting brushes, but it's a little bit of a headache to properly set up, and I think this looks good enough for a chaotic nature scene. Now let's repeat this again with the fourth material, except this time we'll be using Z, the blue channel, as the factor input. And of course, paint with 100% blue color. So now the red color is for the second material, green color is for the third one, blue color is for the fourth one, and if you want the first material back, just paint everything black. Get painting! Another time-lapse time! I think I'm done. So I want to make a quick preview in the rendered mode. Put the grass particle system to 100% though, of course. And I think this looks pretty alright. After we add the lighting, this is gonna look sick. I will change the color of my grass blades though. Add the hue saturation value node to the base color and tweak it. I'll make it darker and match the ground better. Then just copy paste this node to the other grass blades, since we're using multiple different instances. But now this looks a lot better. Put the grass back to 10%. Okay. Take a good look at your reference, and we'll keep coming back to it. As a finale to this part, we'll finally add some textures to the house. It was about time. The roof edge is made of wood, so I'll select it, get rid of a test material, and give it a new one, which I'll call wood. Shader editor, here we go. Go to your textures folder and bring in all the wood textures. Same process as always, connect everything up. Okay, the wood is now here, but we have to go back to the reference to see where all the wood parts are. Since the UVs are all done, I'm just gonna go ahead and select all the objects that are made of wood in this house, just shift-clicking everything. And in the end, we'll select our roof border, so it's the active selection. Then press Ctrl L and select Link Materials. This will look at your active selection and give everything else that same material as it has, which in this case is wood. Now I'll do that for the rest of the house. All the little window frames and everything. It helps if you isolate selection. Side note, I forgot to separate these windows up here, so I'll do that now, real quick. But our wood now has different scaling. Some parts are very defined and small, and others are large and pixelated. That's because we did all the UV unwrapping individually, and they have different scales on the UVs. So now we're gonna select all the wood objects again, open the UV editor window, hop into edit mode, and unwrap all of those at once. Now their scales on the UV map are relative to their actual scales, and all the wood texture should be equally dense. But if we zoom in, we can see that the shape of the plank is going against the fibers of the wood texture. So select everything in the UV and rotate it by 90 degrees. So the texture is moving along the planks, because that's how planks are made. You know. Just double checking to make sure all the planks are going with the wood fibers, and if they don't, I would individually rotate the ones that are not. Now, if we zoom into the house, we can see that the texture resolution is really bad. Like, I can see pixels bad. And this is one of the beauties of working with tileable textures. I can select all this and scale in and out as much as I want. There's no tiling or seams, because this is a tileable texture. It's made in a way that all the edges align perfectly if you tile it. So I can just scale this up and get virtually more resolution for free. I do need to be careful of the realistic scale of the wood fibers though. Wood fibers in real life are not this big, so I have to make sure that they're properly sized. That's one thing. That's the only thing. And this feels fine. Let's go back into the shader editor. I think this wood is too bright and red. You know the drill. I'm gonna add the hue saturation value node. Make the whole thing darker, desaturated, and shift more towards yellow. I think this is better. Now let's do the chimney. We have two textures here, so let's try both. Give it a new material, connect the textures, scale the UVs. Once again, this is just because we have tileable textures. This is not common practice. If we worked with custom ones and texture painting, we should not touch UVs after the textures have been made. What we're doing here is a luxury of tileable textures. I like this material a lot, so I'll add it to the base as well. And of course, always scale and rotate the UVs so the texture looks nice on the model. Now let's work on the walls. Remove the old material and give it a new plaster material. Now I'll connect the non-damaged, non-mossy plaster textures, the cleanest variant that I have. Obviously, scale the textures again, put all of this in a box with Ctrl J, rename it and start adding the other textures into their own principled BSDF. Adding the texture with a little bit more damage. Now I have two different principled BSDFs in here with two sets of textures. Now just duplicate the second bit, unparent with Alt-P, and just swap out the textures for the next material. That's a little bit faster. Now it's also a good time to color those frames so you know which material is which. Once you have all 4 here, they don't have the same scale, so I'll use the mapping and texture coordinate nodes to resize them individually so they all make sense on the house. A quick shortcut is to hold Alt, Shift, and right-click drag to quickly connect the mapping output into the image vector input, and then Shift right-click drag across the connections to wire them together. This is all thanks to Node Wrangler, and why it's illegal if you don't use it. Don't make me come back again. Once it's all scaled, add a mix shader node, plug the cracked version into the first one and the normal one into the second version, then add the image texture, which we'll use as a mask for the factor slider. Click New, rename it, set it to 2K, click OK. But now if I select the image texture in the house and hop into Texture Paint and start painting, my paint will repeat. Why is that? Because I've scaled up my UV map to get the proper texture scale. But these UVs are now repeating because they're exceeding the 1x1 UDIM. Everything outside of this is just a repeat of the same texture, even the ones that are painted manually. This is where we'll add the second UV map. Yes, you can do that. Under the Object Data tab, drop down UV Maps, where we can see the current UV map, the one that is scaled. Then I'll click the plus icon and add a new UV map and rename it so there's no confusion. Now with the new UV map selected, I'll unwrap this again so everything fits in the 1x1 UDIM. You can click between these two so you can see that it is in fact storing 2 completely different UV maps, sorry. So we'll use the first one for all the tiling and the textures, and we'll use the second one for the mask painting so we can reveal different materials. Because we're manually painting though, I feel like we're not using enough of this UV space. Remember, everything that is empty is just image resolution thrown out the window. So I'll press U and select Smart UV Project, which will take up more of this space and more of my resolution will be put to good use. Now usually the UV map with the camera icon will be on by default, but just to be safe, I want to be safe, add a new node and search for the UV map node. Select the original UV map and connect that to the input of the mapping node instead of the texture coordinates. And of course do that for all the tile textures, obviously. And finally, add a new UV map node, select the new unwrapped UVs, and plug this into the vector input of the mask image. So everything else is using the same old UVs, but this mask that we're painting is using the new UVs, so it's not gonna repeat. Now separate XYZ node, use each color channel as a mask for the next material. X is red, plug it in the factor. Looks like the default black is the cracked plaster texture, and by painting pure red, we're painting the normal plaster on top of it. We can just swap these 2 inputs if you want, but I'm not bothered. I'm just gonna continue like this. I'll just start painting. I want to paint interesting patterns, like parts of the walls are crumbling and falling apart due to all the moisture and lack of maintenance. Usually that would happen in places where moisture would usually settle in the house, usually on the foundation, near openings like windows, underneath the roof and so on. But I'm painting broader than that, because I've got 2 additional layers of humid plaster which is usually in the same area. Now that I finished the cracks paint, I feel like my regular plaster doesn't quite match the same color, so I'll add a hue saturation value node to make it more yellowish and similar to the cracked version of the plaster. You can always swap the color back to black and paint the previous material, or even drop down the strength with Shift and F. You know, just like with sculpting. Told you, same shortcuts all across the software, it's great. Now that it's done, add a new mix shader node, plug in the current result in the next shader, plug the Y channel, which is green, into the factor slider. So now the green color will paint the next material. Same as before, start painting. This is even more moisture, so it's mostly present in corners and cavities and such. Maybe look at real references from actual moldy houses for that. There's not really much I can say here. And of course, repeat this process again, mix shader, connect the materials, use the Z channel, which is blue, and paint with blue to reveal the final material. Another time-lapse time. Yup, that's one moldy house. After randomizing my roof tiles, some of them are poking through the wood, so I'll just manually move those in, making use of the L linked selection thing. Looks like I forgot to give the tops a wooden texture, so select them and select anything else that's made of wood. Control L, link materials, that's good. Then rotate and scale all the UVs so it roughly matches the rest of the house. Now finally, select the roof, give it a new material, call it roof tiles. Throw in all the textures, connect them up, then select the rest of the roof tiles and give it the same material. Give it the mapping nodes, put it in a frame, duplicate the whole thing and swap all the textures for the second roof material we downloaded. And it looks like I'm just gonna keep the second material because the first one looks like crap. This is better, so I'm just gonna delete the entire first one. Now I'll add another mix node, set it to color, and put it right after the base color. Set the mode to multiply and set the bottom color to something more green, like a moss color. For the factor input, we'll use the same base color and run it through a color ramp first so we can clamp it. adjust the colors to get a nice black and white pattern, and plug it in the factor. Now we can drop the white color on the color ramp into something more gray to decrease the intensity of this effect. This should give us a nice mossy and old feel on the roof. Looking through the camera, there's a few holes inside the roof, so just select those in edit mode and rotate them in a way to cover it up, just making quick corrections along the way. We can customize this roof even more. All these roof tiles feel roughly the same, while they should vary in brightness like any other non-industrial roof tile thing. I want to show you the geometry shader node. This node is procedural and it takes input from your actual geometry. Let's preview the random per island output. But this is one that requires the Cycles render engine to properly work. So I'll hop into render mode real quick, and as you can see, this node will output a random color from 0 to 1 on any piece of geometry that isn't connected together. And since we want to randomize the brightness of our tiles, this is perfect. I'll add another mix node after the moss and plug in the random per island into the factor slider. Set the mode to multiply and set the bottom color to black. This will randomly darken some of the tiles. Now I'll preview the material, hop into render mode, and then raise the brightness on the black color to decrease the effect. That's what I'm talking about. I won't be able to see it in material mode, but I know it's there once I hit render. That's all I need. Select the windows and give them a new material, rename it, and click on the principled BSDF here, because we'll swap that out for a glass BSDF, since we want this to be glass. Then select the edges of the smaller roofs and give it a wood material as well, obviously rescaling the UVs to fit the rest of the house. Taking a look at the whole scene now, you'll always find little things to improve and correct, and one such thing is the tint of the ivy. So open the ivy instance collection, and the ivy one is the one with the leaves. So shader editor, give it a hue saturation value node, and make it more bluish and desaturated to fit the rest of the scene. One last thing that's worth mentioning in this part of the course is that you must save your painted textures, or you'll have to do it all over again. If I select my house, go into the shader editor, and preview the mask that I've painted, it looks like a rainbow jumble. This texture has been painted inside Blender and doesn't exist on your computer outside of that. So if you don't specifically save it, it's gonna be gone the next time you open Blender. So open up the UV editor, browse for the house mask, and also the floor mask, because we also painted that. So you have it previewed, and then you'll see an asterisk next to the image dropdown, indicating that the image is unsaved. Drop down image, click Save As, and save it in your Textures folder. Now this texture exists on your computer, and Blender will treat it like any other normal texture. It's gonna read from that file, and it's gonna work fine the next time you open it. Don't forget that. And the final part, corrections. Now, this is an important part of the process that nobody really talks about. Sure, a tutorial might look fancy when everything works the first try, but the reality of the situation is that it doesn't work like that. None of us actually do that. We all go back and forth and make changes and try 20 different hues of color, which are completely identical in the end. This is a very necessary part of the project, and it makes a big difference in the end. So before we end this tutorial, I'm gonna go back and polish a few things to make them look nicer. I decided to include this part in as well. First up, the wooden beams are too clean. Compared to the rest of the house, we have to cripple it. Select any wood object and open the shader editor. I'll put the existing material inside a frame and add a new principled BSDF. I'll then use a noise texture with mapping nodes and using object coordinates this time. This won't use the UVs and it'll take into account the object scale. Now I'll add a color ramp node, squash it down, and change the black and white colors into different shades of the existing moss colors on the wall. You can always change the scale of the noise, but I'm also going to play with some other settings. Plug the noise texture into the bump node as well, into the height input. This will give us normal information, so plug this into the normal input. It's extreme, so bring down the distance on the node until it looks nice. Now add a mix shader node and plug them both in. For the factor input, we'll use another magical node that adjusts to your geometry, and that is the ambient occlusion node. But this also can't be previewed in material mode, and it needs the Cycles render engine. This node will give you a completely white output, except in cavities and places where ambient occlusion would naturally occur. So if we take this ambient occlusion node through a color ramp node and bring the black value up, it will exaggerate the effect. But we need a white mask, not a black one. So I'll drop down this arrow and click Flip Color Ramp, which will invert it. If I plug this into the factor now and preview it, I can see that we get a moss-like materials in the cavities of the wood. Mess with the color ramp to fine-tune the results. On top of that, I'll add another noise texture, run that through a color ramp node, and make high contrast black and white blobs. Raise the detail and the roughness on the noise texture, and then add a mask node and set it to add. Add both of these masks together. Remember, black is 0 and adding 0 to anything does nothing. So only the bright parts are gonna get added together. So I combine both of the masks. This is my new factor input. and you can mess with the settings anytime to get a different result. There's lots and lots of tweaks happening here, so the house now looks better. But remember, there's also ambient occlusion on top, which we can't see in material mode. Keep in mind that's going to be visible in the render. Next, I want to give my roof edge a bevel modifier and tune it in so it's not that sharp. Then select all the wooden objects while selecting the roof edge last, press Ctrl L and click Copy Modifiers. So all the wooden objects now have a bit of bevel to them, so they're less sharp. You can skip this step if your computer is struggling, don't worry. And this is where I'll leave it at for this part. We've UV unwrapped the house, shattered the glass, added ivy, tapped into texture painting, masking and procedural texturing with multiple UV maps, etc, etc. We've used a very diverse set of tools, which was the goal of this course, to show you as many tools and teach you as many ways to tackle issues while bringing your ideas to life. So I hope you found it useful. Your homework today is to finish the texture painting and dial in the materials and the ivy. Don't copy me, just make something that looks nice. In the next part, we'll be playing with simulations and particle systems, as well as finishing the project with tiny tweaks. We'll finalize the lighting and open the Compositor tab to show you how compositing works, and finally hit that render button and create this beautiful house. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comment section or join my Discord server where you can get assistance from the entire community. It's a fun place, you can share your progress and get feedback. You're all invited, link is in the description. But apart from that, thank you for watching and I'll see you one last time in the final part of the course. Stay sharp.